Our next speaker is Dr. Edward Ted Fitzsimons. In 2015, the obviously published research in the Journal of Clinical Pathology entitled Improved Detection of Hereditary Haemochromatosis. I heard Ted speak at a meeting we organised in Glasgow, and we had a rapt audience then, and it was worth our journey up from Lancashire for that talk alone, and I'm sure he won't disappoint us today.
Thank you very much for asking me to speak today. I'm Ted Fitzsimons. I'm a haematologist in Glasgow, in the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board. It's the largest health board in Scotland, population of about 1.2 million. And I've been asked today to explain why haematologists should be involved in the care of patients with hemochromatosis. So I think we all know that the best care for hemochromatosis is delivered as part of a multidisciplinary team. And why should haematology, and in particular why should this particular haematologist, be a member of that multidisciplinary team? Well, the answer is actually because we all pump iron. Not perhaps in the way that the magnificent Arnold Schwarzenegger is talking about pumping iron, but we pump iron in our red blood cells because iron is an essential component of hemoglobin. And these are our red blood cells, and they have a high demand for our iron, our body iron. Another reason for why haematologists should be involved is that the best treatment for hemochromatosis is venesection. And removing 1 unit of blood gets rid of about something like 200 milligrams of iron. And can I just remind you that after your hemochromatosis is controlled, you can become blood donors. So you're an invaluable source of blood donations to the health service. So perhaps those 3 reasons are reasons enough for why a haematologist should be involved in the care of hemochromatosis. But there's more. This is the late, great Alan Jacobs, Professor of Haematology in Cardiff, from the 70s to the 90s. And I was fortunate to work with this man during the 1980s. And Alan Jacobs set up a team of iron experts, Mark Warwood and Ivor Cavell, and of course himself. And it was in Cardiff that the serum ferritin assay was developed. And it was in Cardiff that they related the amount of serum ferritin to the amount of iron in body stores. So that roughly speaking, 1 unit of serum ferritin is equivalent to approximately 8 milligrams of iron in our body stores. And lastly, in Cardiff they developed a model of iron metabolism called ferrokinetics. And this ferrokinetics delivered formulae for what was happening to iron in the body. And from these formulae they calculated that in the plasma, each one of us would turn over about 50 milligrams of iron per day. I'm sorry, but maybe you already know explanation of these terms, but can we just go over them again just for maybe some of the less scientific members of the group? Okay? Transferrin. So transferrin is the protein that transports iron throughout the body. All right? We refer to it most commonly as to the percentage saturation, the percentage of our transferrin that is saturated with iron. Ferritin. Ferritin is the protein that stores iron. And virtually all of our ferritin is intracellular. It is in our cells. Iron stored in ferritin is safe. But there is a tiny amount of ferritin which we can measure in the serum, and that is serum ferritin. And serum ferritin contains no iron. What we do know is that the level of this serum ferritin is directly related to the amount of iron that we have in our body stores. And as I've said, about 1 unit of ferritin in the serum is equivalent to about 8 milligrams of iron in our stores. And the last term to become familiar with, hepcidin. Hepcidin is our low iron hormone. It's the gatekeeper. It's there to keep our iron levels low. Okay. So let's deal with these in turn then. Transferrin and iron. The transferrin molecule here has got 2 iron binding sites. The red dots represent iron, and the Ys represent our transferrin. Normally, with normal amounts of iron, we would expect about 30% of our transferrin in our plasma to be saturated with iron. In iron deficiency, the liver produces more in response to low iron, the liver produces more transferrin, and the saturation falls. So only about 15%, or less than 15% of the transferrin in the body is saturated with iron. In hemochromatosis, we have too much iron, and in response to that, the body makes less transferrin. The transferrin saturation is increased, and as it approaches 100% saturation, you have this fear of developing iron that is not bound to transferrin, free iron. We call it non-transferrin bound iron, and that is metabolically highly active and highly toxic. Serum ferritin. As I say, the assay developed in Cardiff and now used everywhere. Serum ferritin is reduced in iron deficiency. If you get a low serum ferritin, you're iron deficient. There's no other cause. It's increased in iron overload, but it's increased in a whole load of other things. It's increased in patients with liver damaged, and it's increased by inflammation in the tissues. One of the reasons why you want a hematologist involved in the care is that serum ferritin is measured and reported by hematology labs. So, let's try and understand what's going on with iron in our body. Normally speaking, take for instance myself. I've got about 4 grams of iron in the body, and it's locked in the body. There's iron, we lose very little iron. We lose only about 1 or 2 milligrams of iron a day in our bowel. The girls, young women, will lose a little bit more as a result of menstruation, plus or minus the effect of pregnancy. The amount of iron we absorb is controlled by the hormone hepcidin. The iron is carried in the body on transferrin, and it's delivered to those tissues. All tissues need iron, but it's delivered predominantly to those tissues that have the most demand for iron. And the cells that have the most demand for iron are our red cells in our bone marrow. But that's for our hemoglobin, but of course our myoglobin in our muscles are going to require iron, and enzymes in our liver, very important enzymes in our liver, are going to require iron as well. Our red cells live for about 120 days, and at the end of their lifespan, they're destroyed in what we call the reticuloendothelial system. The reticuloendothelial system is where we store our iron. And iron is released from these stores. About 50 milligrams of iron is released a day from these stores under the control of hepcidin. And this keeps our transferrin saturation about 30%. Okay, that's A-level iron metabolism. Can I give it to you in O-level? Here we have. So maybe you don't have O-levels in England. Here we have body stores. We've got 4 grams of iron. 3 of our grams are in our red cells. 1 of our grams is elsewhere. And to stay in iron balance, we need to absorb only 1 or 2 milligrams of iron a day from our bowel. What's happening in hemochromatosis? Well, what we know is happening now in hemochromatosis is we lose the effect of hepcidin with functional hepcidin deficiency. So let's consider this case. This is a patient with bad hemochromatosis. Instead of having 4 grams of iron, 20 grams. Now, how could you accumulate 20 grams of iron? Well, you'd only need to absorb, say, another extra 3 milligrams from your diet a day. 3 milligrams a day will give you about 1 gram extra per year, and over 20 years that will give you your 20 grams. So we're absorbing more iron, and our body stores will release more iron. Our body stores will release maybe something in the order of 100 milligrams of iron per day, rather than just the 50 milligrams of iron per day. And this is the iron carried on transferrin, which will go to our red cells, but will also then go into our liver, it will go into our muscles, it will go into our hearts, it will go into tissues which don't require the amount of iron that they're being forced to accept. Back to O levels. Okay, here we have our bad hemochromatotic, 20 grams of iron, and you will lose just the 1 milligram of iron per day in the feces as normal, but with the loss of hepcidin, the patient is absorbing 4 to 5 milligrams per day. 20 grams of iron, the red cells only have demand for 3. So what's going to happen to the other 20 grams of iron? In this situation, this patient will certainly be homozygous for the hemochromatosis gene. Their serum ferritin will be raised, it will be above 2,000, and the transferrin saturation will be up round about 100%, and there will be this danger of the patient having non-transferrin bound iron, toxic and metabolically highly active. So where does this iron go? It can go to our liver to cause cirrhosis. It can go to our pancreas to cause diabetes, our joints to cause arthritis, and our skin to cause bronzing. Right, so I returned to the west of Scotland in the late 1980s, and I've had an interest in iron really all my professional life, but more recently it shifted towards hemochromatosis, and that's really because of 2 landmark discoveries. One, of course, is the discovery of the hemochromatosis gene in 1996, and our understanding thereafter that patients with genetic hemochromatosis have functional hepcidin deficiency. So, we know that in Scotland, about 1 in 8 of Scots are carriers for the hemochromatosis gene. So, on the basis of partnerships occurring 1 in 64, we would expect 1 in 64 partnerships in Scotland to be between 2 carriers. And thereafter, the genetics is such that 2 carriers have a 1 in 4 chance of producing a homozygote patient with genetically predisposed to hemochromatosis. So that would give us between 1 in 200 and 1 in 300 Celts are genetically at risk. They're going to be homozygous for hereditary hemochromatosis. Now, the Celtic curse, if you come from the west of Scotland, you'll know that the word Celtic doesn't actually exist. There are only 2 words, it's Celtic and Rangers. And I don't have hemochromatosis genes, but I definitely have green genes. So I am a Celtic man. And this picture is taken visiting the stadium in Lisbon, where Celtic were the first British club to win the European Cup. A year ahead of that Manchester team, I'll have you know. So I've never really been one to go much for the Celtic curse or the Celtic curse. I prefer to think of it as the silent curse. And it is a silent curse because we would predict that in Scotland we've got about 20,000 people who are genetically predisposed. In the UK, about 200,000 people genetically predisposed. Yet, in Scotland, we've got somewhat less than 1,000 cases actually diagnosed, and in England, less than 10,000. So there's a lot out there. It is a silent curse. There's a lot of patients out there with a genetic predisposition that we don't know about. They're hiding in primary care. So, what about serum ferritin? Can I take you back to reminding you that as a hematologist, I measure serum ferritin and I report serum ferritins. We have a population in Greater Glasgow and Clyde of 1.2 million. We perform something like 150,000 serum ferritin estimations a year. Now, it's actually pretty clear what you do with patients who have got low serum ferritins and iron deficiency anemia. There are guidelines for what should be done. But there's no management plan for what to do with patients with high serum ferritins. So we set about in 2010 a pilot study. And the reason I really want to draw your attention to that is it's the only paper I've ever written with my daughter. Sadly, it was probably enough for her because she's gone on to do anaesthetics rather than hematology. So what did this pilot study show? Well, what we looked at serum ferritin values from primary care in patients who are over the age of 30. Now, the primary care population is essentially a well population. And what we found was that in men, the upper limit of normal for serum ferritin is 300. In men, we found that at almost 20% of samples from primary care of men over the age of 30 had serum ferritins above 300. And that was irrespective of age. 30 to 50, 50 to 70, over 70, they all, about almost 20%, had raised serum ferritins. In the women, it was a different story, where serum ferritin normal only goes up to 200. It was very much age dependent. Younger women had a low likelihood of having a raised serum ferritin, but as patients got older, the percentage rose approximately to the same as men. And this reflects the fact that women's serum ferritins, women's iron levels are low as a result of menstruation and as a result of pregnancies. Now, the other thing we found, we looked at the group where the serum ferritin was grossly elevated at more than 1,000. And we identified 56 patients from primary care with serum ferritins more than 1,000, grossly elevated. And we looked through these patients' notes to find out why was the serum ferritin so high. The interesting thing was that we found that 32, more than half of these patients in primary care, had no explanation. So, what did we deduce? We deduced that serum ferritin requests are made frequently. As I say, in the whole of the Glasgow and Clyde, we look at 150,000 a year. If we focus down on samples from primary care and on patients over the age of 30, I'm looking at 30,000 samples a year. GPs use it predominantly to look for iron deficiency anemia, and they know what to do if the ferritin value is low. We saw that 20% of males in this group had ferritins above the normal range, and between 3 and 17, it came out on average 12% of women had serum ferritins above the normal range. And that 50% of patients with very high serum ferritins had no explanation in their case notes. So what's pretty clear is that in primary care, GPs are uncertain as to what to do with raised serum ferritin values. So hemochromatosis is being missed in primary care. So that took us to our next study. We said, how can we find this silent population? How can we try to solve this silent curse? So we looked at almost 4,000 samples, and we took it, these samples sent from primary care. Anyone with a serum ferritin above 200 we looked at, and we measured the transferrin saturation in all of these samples. If the transferrin saturation was more than 30%, we carried out the screen for hemochromatosis gene. Why did we not look at anyone less than 30%? If your transferrin saturation is less than 30%, you cannot load with iron. It doesn't happen. So from this almost 4,000, we came to almost 900 males and almost 900 women. And in this group, we identified 58 patients with genetic predisposition to hemochromatosis and 74 women. We put all the analysis together and we came up with our algorithm. So in patients in primary care over the age of 30 years, if serum ferritin is above 200 and transferrin saturation above 40%, 16% of these patients are going to be homozygous for hemochromatosis. They're going to be genetically at risk. In males, serum ferritins of 300 and transferrin saturations of more than 50%, it gave us 18% of patients would be homozygous. Now, those rates compare very favourably with family screening. If you assume that most patients with hemochromatosis arise from two parents who are each carriers, then the carrier rate, the detection rate you would expect to pick up from family studies would be 25%. The detection rate we would be picking up from this algorithm isn't quite 25%, but it's very close to it. And we know that although neither the Scottish government nor the English government accept the need to screen the population for hemochromatosis, we know they do accept family screening. And this algorithm gives us percentages that are not greatly short of what we would normally expect from family studies. The laboratory impact of this algorithm would be very little, and it would be very cheap. We would measure transference, it would lead to something like only 2% increase in screening for the gene in women, and 6% in our male samples. And the enrichment above the prevalence in the normal population would be 50-fold. So we can identify a population in primary care where the risk of them having genetic predisposition to hemochromatosis is around 20%. What clinical impact, and this is a cost impact then, the cost impact would be then, in my own health board, we would anticipate we would pick up 200 new cases a year. In the west of Scotland, 400. In Scotland, we would pick up 800 new cases per year. And of course, that would be picked up, that would be increased more following family screening, having identified hemochromatosis in the index case. There is a lesson, there is more to this then. If 20% of our patients have got hemochromatosis, it indicates that 80% of our patients do not. Okay, and even in patients whose serum ferritin was very high, we looked at, I think we looked at about almost 180 patients whose serum ferritin was more than 1,000. Yeah, it was 180 patients. Serum ferritin more than 1,000. 20% of males had hemochromatosis, 10% of females only. The vast majority of these patients who did not have hemochromatosis had either alcohol abuse or liver disease. 10% disseminated malignancy. What is clear is that anyone with a serum ferritin over 1,000 needs looked at. There's something the matter here. So, the conclusions from the study. The vast majority of patients in primary care with high serum ferritins don't have hemochromatosis. If we reflex measure transferrin and transferrin saturation, so what we do in Scotland, we get lots of requests for serum ferritin. And what I'm suggesting we do is, if the serum ferritin is raised, we would automatically measure transferrin saturation. And if the transferrin saturation is raised, we would go on to do the gene test for hemochromatosis with a pickup rate just less than 20%. The laboratory and clinical burden on the health service would be low, and we are engaging with the Scottish Government in the hope that this algorithm could be introduced into areas in which there's high prevalence of hemochromatosis. Thank you.